As the 80s turned into the 90s, the holy grail of the video game world was side-scrolling. Smash hits like Mario had proven that players wanted to feel like they could explore a single, massive environment seamlessly. But at the time, PCs were trying to become affordable for every household, which meant that many weren't putting in the most expensive hardware. Only dedicated gaming consoles like the Nintendo Entertainment System had enough horsepower to run a side-scrolling game. PCs had to make do with individual rooms. But one day, a gifted young programmer named John Carmack figured out a trick that could get smooth scrolling onto average computers. At the same time, his co-worker John Romero had gotten an offer from publisher Apogee to distribute games over an emerging technology called the Internet. Combining their talents with their friends Adrian Carmack and Tom Hall, they created Commander Keen, a side-scrolling adventure game. Apogee released a free trial of the game over the internet, and then offered to send players the rest of the game for a fee. It made $30,000 in 10 days, an absolute phenomenon and a system shock to the computer gaming crowd. The guys quit their jobs at Softdisk and started their own company, which they called id Software. They had already changed what was possible on a PC. They were about to transform an entire industry forever. The guys at id had their work cut out for them because they weren't quite free of Softdisk yet. Carmack had created his tech on Softdisk's time, and they had made Commander Keen on Softdisk's computers. But then they had sold the game to Apogee, and Softdisk never saw a dime. To keep from getting sued by their old company, id agreed to develop a game for them every 2 months at a rate of $5,000 per game. But they wanted to be making their own games as well, and the dudes of id had a new inspiration. Wing Commander had released the previous year, taking the 3D mechanics popularized by Flight Simulator and adding a combat element into it. The result was a revelation to the guys, a 3-dimensional vehicle shooter from the first-person perspective. Technically, this was nothing new. Battlezone had released all the way back in 1980 with the same basic mechanics. But Wing Commander had updated and modernized the idea and made it look good. The problem was that it was slow. High-resolution graphics in 3 dimensions in real time was a huge burden on the processors of the time. But id's resident programming genius, John Carmack, thought he could do better. In April 1991, id made Hover Tank 3D for Softdisk to distribute. It was a 3D vehicle shooter in which a pilot had to navigate his tank through a maze to rescue citizens while fighting off mutant monsters. Gameplay-wise, it wasn't a revolution over anything Wing Commander had done. Technically, however, it was light years ahead. Carmack's engine avoided the slow jerkiness of earlier 3D games, and presented the player with a smooth, fast world. While an important milestone for the company, proving that the guys could handle 3D game design, it didn't leave a big impact on the industry. As a Softdisk product, it was only available to their subscriber base, and thus couldn't spread by word of mouth the way id's internet-distributed Keen games did. Knowing that, and knowing that Commander Keen games could make them much more money than $5,000 a pop, the guys decided to revisit the side-scrolling world, once again with updated tech from Carmack. At the same time, they wanted a change of scenery. The guys had grown tired of Louisiana. Most of them had only moved there to work at Softdisk. Tom Hall, in particular, longed for his native Wisconsin, and convinced the guys to move up to Madison. In September 1991, id Software invaded and set up residence in its employees' new apartments. While working on the next Commander Keen games, they also needed to get a new game out to Softdisk. Switching states hadn't ended their obligations. Hover Tank 3D had been cool, and they wanted to work more with this new dimension while keeping Keen with its side-scrolling roots. As such, November's Softdisk game was another first-person game, this time without any vehicles involved. Instead, in Catacomb 3D, the player would be a powerful wizard blasting monsters away with his spells. Graphically, it was another leap forward, with decorated walls and more characters on screen at once. And without id knowing it, the game was also the snowball that started the avalanche. By taking the vehicle out of the equation, Catacomb truly brought the player into an immersive experience. By showing the wizard's own hand from a first-person perspective, it made the player feel like it was actually him casting those spells. Wing Commander had shown a hand as well, but in that case it reinforced the idea that the player was protected by a powerful starship. In Catacomb, the player only had himself. It made him feel both vulnerable and empowered at the same time. It was a tiny, little difference, but it was all the difference in the world. When Scott Miller at Apogee, the company that distributed id's non-softdisk games through the internet, saw Catacomb, he was blown away. He loved it, and he asked if the guys could make a game like that for him. Id tackled the problem after finishing up with the new Keen game. What should they do? Carmack was already rolling on yet another upgrade to his already groundbreaking game engine. But they needed an idea to fuel that engine with. Then programmer John Romero hit on a goldmine. What if they did something like Castle Wolfenstein? Castle Wolfenstein was a 1981 PC game in which a prisoner of war in a Nazi fortress breaks out of his cell and shoots down or sneaks by guards on his way to freedom. It had been a great game at the time. Now that id was armed with Carmack's tech, maybe it was time to bring the idea back. To their surprise and delight, they quickly discovered that the company that owned the rights to Castle Wolfenstein, Muse Software, had gone bust and taken the copyright to its grave. The Wolfenstein IP was now public domain. Anybody could use it without having to pay a royalty. It was settled. Wolfenstein 3D was incoming. The guys were excited about the project, especially Romero, who was soon bursting with ideas. Very quickly, it was apparent that Romero, who up until then had been a programmer, was taking over design duties. In theory, that was supposed to be Tom Hall's job. As it happened, Hall was the one guy who didn't like the Wolfenstein idea. To him, games should be fun, friendly affairs. Commander Keen had been his baby. Now the guys wanted to be shooting down German guards and attack dogs, and what was more, they wanted to do it with tons of blood. Game violence at the time was relatively cartoonish and tame. All of a sudden, Hall found that his co-workers wanted to introduce gore into the medium. He was starting to feel like maybe this wasn't what he'd signed on for. For Romero, it was the opposite. He was concocting a brew of fast-paced action, intense combat, gorgeous art, and gleeful gore. It was harder, edgier, and more brutal than anything else on the market. A heavy metal assault on a world of pop. What was more, they would be distributing the game through Apogee over the internet, which meant that this game could grow by word of mouth in a way Hovertank and Catacomb never could. There was a sense that they were charting unexplored territory, inventing the rules as they went along. There had been plenty of shooters before, but always in the safety of a vehicle. Like Catacomb before it, this game would strip away all barriers between the player and his enemy to make an experience that pit the player himself, all alone, against the German army. Apogee released Wolfenstein 3D to the internet on May 5th, 1992. Nothing was ever the same again. Commander Keen was an incredibly successful game. With basically no inventory and no retailers to pay thanks to its internet approach, the game was bringing in somewhere between $10,000 to $30,000 a month. Wolfenstein brought in $200,000 a month for a year and a half. The gaming world had absolutely exploded around the game. There was nothing like it. Nothing had that same sense of speed and intensity. Nothing looked that good and ran that smoothly. Nothing else dared to show blood. Even the almighty Nintendo Entertainment System had nothing even remotely as immersive as Wolfenstein. A handful of guys in Madison, Wisconsin had electrified the world without ever shipping a copy to physical stores. It was a revolution. And it made the guys the hottest company in the industry. A traditional publisher, FormGen, asked them to make a Wolfenstein that would be sold in stores. The result was Spear of Destiny, which released in September of 1992. Nintendo itself, which had spurned the guys earlier when they tried to sell them a PC port of Mario, now begged them to make a console version of Wolfenstein. But without any blood, and with giant rats replacing the dogs. Shooting dogs in a video game was much too violent. Shooting actual people? That was A-okay. The game even managed to prompt one of the earliest debates on the legal status of the internet. The game had been made by Americans, sold by other Americans, and had never been on a German store shelf. Nevertheless, legions of German kids were playing it. Unfortunately, any representation of the swastika is illegal under German law. Had id Software somehow broken the law? And if so, how? It was one of the first warning signs of the internet phenomenon to come, and its place in a suddenly small world. In the meantime, the game was formally banned in Germany, which didn't stop anyone from downloading it. And if all that wasn't enough, other developers then started asking if they could license Carmack's incredible engine. Now they weren't just selling the game, they were selling the code that powered the game. The money was flooding in, the guys were suddenly rock stars, and id Software was firmly established. But already Romero and the id team were looking towards the future. Clearly, 3D shooters from a first-person perspective, the so-called first-person shooter genre, were taking off. 2D and side-scrolling, the tools that had gotten id off the ground in the first place, were ancient history. There was a sea of change happening, a shift towards immersive environments and high-octane action. Id had begun the wave, and now they were going to ride it for all it was worth. They knew the new game would be a shooter. They just needed to figure out what tone and setting to go for. Whatever it would be, Carmack already had a name, one he thought would encapsulate everything that their next masterpiece would represent to other games on the market. In 1986, the classic film The Hustler had finally received a sequel called The Color of Money. In it, billiards hustler Tom Cruise brings in a black case containing his favorite stick. When someone asks him what's in it, he replies,
Doom.
Tune in next time to watch id conquer the world.